Good afternoon. My name is Jeremiah Smith, and the topic which I decided to focus on is the effects of music on reading comprehension and focus, specifically in adolescent students. To begin, I would like to discuss a scholarly discussion around this topic and the information that is already known. First of all, we know that music has very many benefits psychologically for someone, but specifically music can have benefits in schoolwork. It can be very helpful in schoolwork. It's mainly beneficial because music can help alleviate stress, according to Nekama Yehuda from the Journal of Adult Development. Additionally, music can help increase the mood of the listener or the student, which can thus increase their focus, according to Naveen Kumar from the Research Journal of Pharmaceutical, Biological, and Chemical Sciences. Music is primarily helpful because it has a rhythm, and this rhythm, according to Dawn Kent from Liberty University, is satisfying in a psychological sense for the listener. And this satisfying psychological effect can cause something what's called the Mozart effect, where while listening to music, your IQ points will actually increase by a certain amount. Now, the Mozart effect is mostly seen occurring in orchestral classical music, because orchestral classical has varying levels of rhythm and tempo, and that varying of the music and the complexity of the music is key to increasing intelligence. Jay Jenkins from the Journal of Royal Society of Medicine found that while listening to orchestral classical music, such as Mozart symphonies, IQ points of listeners will increase by 8 to 9 points. However, this is only really prominent in students or listeners of a younger age. The older you get, the less effective the Mozart effect is. The specific kinds of music that are most beneficial when reading or trying to focus is specifically the genre of classical music, according to North Central University. Additionally, music that has limited lyrics, music that's slow, is not loud, or has a consistent tempo really helps in focusing. And this is according to Dr. Timothy Bryan and Amanda Reed from Wellawong University and the State University of New York. Additionally, the listener's familiarity with that music is also a deciding factor in if it helps you focus or not. If you're unfamiliar with the music, you will be distracted supposedly by new sounds and new rhythms that you're not familiar with, and that can be detrimental to reading comprehension as well. And this is according to Mia Mercer from Texas A&M University. Additionally, on the contrary, music can be very harmful to focus and reading comprehension. Music can create what's called a cognitive overload, where the music is too complicated in some circumstances, and when you're listening to it, it will actually distract you from what you're trying to focus on. This is when the music you're listening to surpasses what's called your musical perception abilities, which is your ability to focus and comprehend music. And this is according to Anna Rodel from the University of Twenty. Another source I found saw that pop music will actually help students focus and increase their scores. Emily Sangiorgi did a study and found that when listening to pop music, quiz scores of students will actually increase by 8%. And this is reasoned to the fact that students enjoy pop more, therefore their mood is improved, and hence their focus is improved, because mood and focus go hand in hand very often. However, I noticed something. Pop is not slow, pop has lyrics, and pop is loud, and that completely goes against all of the other sources which I earlier read. So there seems to be some inconsistencies in the studies here and the scholarly discussion around my topic. We find that music creates a cognitive overload if it's complex. That makes sense. However, we also find that pop music and orchestral classical music will sometimes increase mood, focus, and scores, which doesn't make sense in light of the cognitive overload. So I wanted to explore, does complexity really play a role in focus, and in what circumstances is complexity a harmful factor? To learn more about this complexity aspect of music, which I'm discussing, I consulted my school's AP Music Theory teacher, who has a master's in AP Music Theory, and he explained to me that complexity boils down to what is called texture in music. And there's essentially two types of texture. There's thick texture and there's thin texture. Now, texture is, by definition, the complexity of the song, which is how many instruments there are, how many rhythms there are, how many tempo variations there are, and kind of how many clashing viewpoints and themes there are in the music. We find that thick music, there's a type of thick texture called polyphonic texture. As you can see here in this graphic, if each line represented a melody or a rhythm, they all kind of don't comprehend with each other, or they're not very coherent, and they all kind of clash together and create a really complicated song. On the contrary, you have thin texture, and a type of thin texture can be monophonic music. As you can see here with this, it's one simple melody, one simple rhythm, and it's very straightforward and it's very easy to listen to. So if we look at the variables of music which are commonly studied, there's a lot of sources that talk about the volume of music, the lyrics of music, the genre of music, and the instruments of music, and how those affect focus and reading comprehension. So what I want to focus on is, as I discussed before, the texture of music, because there seems to be inconsistencies, and then additionally the tempo of music, because texture and tempo mostly tie closely together in music, and they're not as commonly studied, and I wanted to kind of explore that area because there's not as much research on it. Additionally, the familiarity of music, as I saw previously, familiarity is considered to be a deciding aspect on whether or not the music is beneficial to focus. So I wanted to tie that into my study to see how it affects texture, tempo, and then of course the focus of the student. This leads me to my gap of my research, which is the texture and tempo of music and its effects on reading comprehension and focus, which is of course my research question. To what extent does the texture and tempo of music affect reading comprehension and focus? And then I will focus on specifically how this applies to adolescent students. This leads me to my method of my study, which is the strategy by which I will gather data for my research. I decided to do an experiment style combination of a survey and a test. What I'll do is I will take a sample of students and I'll divide them into evenly distributed groups, and I'll give each of those groups a different song to listen to. The songs will have varying characteristics depending on their texture and their tempo, and then those groups of students will listen to the song they have been assigned while taking a similar test. The test will be the same between all the groups. I will then take their test scores and compare the results to find how the music they were listening to affected their test scores. The test which I will give the groups will be split into 3 parts. I will have a pre-test survey, which will ask the students about their study habits, how often they read, and if they listen to music while they read or while they do homework. Additionally, I'll ask them their grade and their ACT experience. And then my reading comprehension test, this will actually be scored, and this is what will be used to determine the effects that the music has on reading comprehension and focus. The ACT reading test will be a short passage with 10 questions, and I decided to use ACT because a lot of students are required to take the ACT, so it's more likely chance that they'll have ACT experience, and the type of test to provide to them will not be too foreign, and it shouldn't be too difficult to take. The final part will be a post-test survey. I'll ask the students about their difficulty of focus, like how hard it was to focus on a scale of 1 to 10. And then I'll ask them their familiarity with the songs. That's the familiarity aspect I wanted to tie in. And then if they enjoyed the songs they listened to. I planned to split my group into 5 groups total. I planned to have a control group, a group with thick textured music and fast tempo, another group with thick texture and slow tempo music, a third group with thin texture and fast tempo music, and then a 4th group with thin texture and slow tempo music. However, when I gathered my sample, I realized that I wouldn't have enough students to divide them evenly into 5 groups without having extremely skewed scores. So I decided to cut groups 2 and 3 due to my limitations. I kept groups 1 and 4 because they mainly focus on the extremes of the variables I'm focusing on, so that'll still allow me to explore their effects. However, because I lack a large number of groups, it'll be more difficult to separate texture and tempo in my results, but I don't think that'll be an issue, or I didn't think that would be an issue because texture and tempo tie so closely together. The music I used in my groups, for the thick texture group, I used Mozart's Symphony No. 40. It's a very complex song with a lot going on. It's orchestral classical. As you can see here with the sheet music, each line is a different instrument, so there's a lot going on in the song, and each of the instruments follow different rhythms, different patterns, so they're all clashing together and it would be really complex to listen to. And then additionally for my thin texture group, I decided to use Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata first movement. and then Debussy's Clair de Lune, which are both very slow single piano songs. As you can see here, this is Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata. It's very easy, it's very simple, and it's a slow piano melody that follows a certain pattern. The variables of my study, I would like to hold some variables constant as to not clash with the variables that I'm studying. Of course, the independent variables of my study, which are the variables I want to change and I want to gather data on, are the texture and tempo of music. And then the dependent variables, which are the variables I'll hold constant, are the environment of the classroom, so the area the students take the test in, so that doesn't affect their scores at all. And then the volume of the music, because volume can really increase or decrease focus. So I would hold that constant, so that doesn't affect anything. And then of course the intelligence level of my group, I would hold that constant so there aren't skewed data points. So in order to keep those variables constant, I distributed a sign-up form to my school. I gave the sign-up form to AP classes, which consist of mostly upperclassmen students. I decided to do AP classes because their intelligence level would be usually higher and then more closely together. That way their intelligence level is constant and that would be held similar. And then I chose upperclassmen students because there's a higher chance that the upperclassmen students have ACT experience and that they would take my survey more seriously. After distributing my sign-up form for about 2 weeks, I got 33 students to sign up, 87% of which had ACT experience and 97% of which were upperclassmen. This leads me to the results of my experiment. Looking at the scores of the tests which I distributed, I did it 1 out of 10 points. The control group scored a 7.73 points out of 10. The thick texture fast tempo group scored a 7.82 out of 10. And then the thin texture slow tempo group scored an 8.18 out of 10. And then looking at the focus scores, I asked the students that are focused on a scale of 1 to 10, 1 being the easiest to focus and 10 being the hardest. The control group scored an average of 4.0 difficulty. The thick texture group scored an average of 5.91, and then the thin texture group scored an average of 4.18. If we look closely at my thin texture group, we find that there was a noticeable benefit in the score, although it wasn't too much. Their score rose an average of 0.41 points. There was a 0.54 point difference from the control group, so there was a slight increase in score. However, there was minimal focus to the difficulty in focus rating. As you can see, it was a 0.18 difference, so students rated it more difficult. However, it's such a small difference, I believe it falls under my margin of error, which is essentially score changes as a result of unequal grouping rather than the variables I'm studying. And then closely analyzing the thick texture group, we find that there was minimal change in score, a 0.09 point difference. That would also fall under my margin of error. However, the focus, there was a very, very noticeable change. It rated at 5.91 difficulty, and that is a 1.91 difference from the control group. So that really shows how difficult it was to focus with the thick textured music. If we look at the familiarity aspect, which I tied in, there was virtually no change whatsoever. I asked them if they were familiar with the music, and then if they weren't. And of those who said yes, they scored the exact same of those who said no in both groups. So familiarity made no difference whatsoever. So if I look at my results in relation to the scholarly text, we find that my results correspond with the fact that slow music is beneficial because we saw that slight score increase with the slow and thin textured music. Additionally, we find that complex music is distracting. That also goes with the sources that I looked at because we saw that really high increase in focus difficulty. However, my results do refute against the fact that complex music improves intelligence. I didn't see that at all here, so the Mozart effect was not prevalent at all in this situation. And I believe that boils down to the age of my sample. Like I said, the Mozart effect is most prominent in younger ages, and because I focused on adolescent students, the Mozart effect seemed to have no change whatsoever in my scores. Additionally, the fact that familiarity affects the effectiveness of the music in focus, I saw no change with familiarity, and familiarity really seems to play no role in this situation. This leads me to the conclusion of my study. We find that overall, thin texture and slow tempo music, specifically when it's classical, is the most beneficial to focus and reading comprehension, because we saw that there was minimal focus changes and there were somewhat larger increase in scores. So we know that when you're listening to classical music, thin texture and slow tempo is the best bet, especially if you're of adolescent age. I believe the main takeaway from my experiment is that thick texture music is harmful. I discussed that pop music is beneficial when listening to, pop music is beneficial because students enjoy it more. And I was wondering, was the thick texture of the music harmful to the students' focus because they didn't enjoy it? I asked the students if they enjoyed the music or not, and 100% of my students said that they either enjoyed the music or they just felt neutral about it and didn't really dislike it at all. So we find that the fact that they enjoyed the music didn't really have any change in their focus or the effectiveness of the music. We just find that in general, overall, thick texture is harmful to focus when in this situation. Some limitations in my study, my sample size was really small and I found that to be harmful. If I had a larger sample size, I would have had more groups and I would have been able to have more specific data points. Additionally, there could have been uneven intelligence levels across my groups, and that could have skewed my data very slightly, but I incorporated that in my margin of error as to not have that affect any conclusion I draw. And then some future implications of my study findings could be used to improve students' study habits and the effectiveness of their studying and their reading comprehension. Additionally, it could also be used to affect classroom rules and maybe teachers' perceptions on music in the classroom. And then it could also add on to future studies and help future studies narrow down the points made about texture and its correlation to focus. And that's it. Thank you.
You did a really great job. How did you determine which results generated by your research method were most important in informing your new understanding?
I believe the points that focused on the points that related to the focus of the student were the most important, because focus is really the main determinant on whether or not your reading comprehension is improved. So I tried to focus on the focus levels of the student a little more than rather their scores, because their scores were most likely to reflectant of their focus levels.
How did your limitations of your method or data influence your new understanding?
The fact that I had low sample sizes really affected the amount of information I was allowed to draw from my research. So it kind of forced me to draw larger and more larger conclusions. If I had a larger sample size and that limitation wasn't an issue, I would be able to have more specific conclusions and be able to lay out really specific points from my research. But because of my limitations, I wasn't able to do that.
Great job.
How did your expert advisor facilitate your deeper understanding of the research process?
My expert advisor really allowed me to gather a more complex understanding on the situation I was trying to focus on. While I was researching, I didn't really know what complexity of music referred to, or I didn't know how to address that. So I asked him to sort of explain what complexity could mean and how complexity could be addressed when discussing the music and the parts of music. So he really helped me to align those findings and allowed me to be pointed in the direction of my research question and kind of have more specific goals.
Very good.